I'm Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions here at Princeton, and it's my honor to welcome you to today's conference. Our conference is being sponsored by the Madison Program's Initiative on Freedom of Thought, Inquiry, and Expression, co-directed by my distinguished colleagues, Professors Keith Whittington and Bernard Haeckel. Before proceeding, I note that today is Veterans Day, and I'm sure you would all join me in thanking our veterans, especially those who've served in combat over the years, and especially our Princeton alumni who are veterans of our armed forces. The question we have gathered to consider this morning is whether, and if so when, non-sectarian state and private universities, or departments or other units within such universities, may take public positions and put out public statements on controversial moral, political, and constitutional or other legal issues that are not directly related to the mission of the university. For example, this past summer, when the Supreme Court of the United States handed down its decision in the Dobbs case, reversing Roe versus Wade, should I, or would it have been appropriate for me, as director of the Madison Program, to put out the following statement? The James Madison Program of Princeton University applauds the Supreme Court of the United States for rectifying a longstanding constitutional and moral atrocity. The so-called constitutional right to abortion, which had been imposed on the nation by the Supreme Court nearly 50 years ago in Roe versus Wade, lacked any basis in the text, logic, structure, or original understanding of the Constitution of the United States. It was an act of raw judicial power, to quote Justice Byron White's dissent, which deprived the American people of their right to work through constitutionally prescribed democratic procedures to protect innocent children in the womb against the lethal violence of abortion. The Supreme Court has finally relegated a tragic error to the ash heap of history alongside such similarly unjust and ignominious decisions as Dred Scott against Sanford, Plessy against Ferguson, Buck against Bell, and Korematsu against the United States. Now, had I put out such a statement, it would have accurately reflected my views, along with the views of many students, faculty, and staff associated with the Madison Program. But I did not put out any such statement, nor did I, for so much as a moment, consider putting out such a statement. My understanding was that while I may certainly speak for myself and identify myself as a Princeton faculty member while doing so, it would be grossly improper for me to identify the university or one of its units, in this case the Madison Program, with a view of the rightness or wrongness of Roe versus Wade or the Dobbs decision or the justice or injustice of abortion. These are matters on which reasonable people of goodwill in our community of teachers and learners disagree. One is welcome at Princeton and in the Madison Program or any other unit of this university, whether one is pro-life, as I am, or pro-choice, as a great many others in our community are, whether one thinks of Roe versus Wade as a gross violation of human rights or as a vindication of human rights. It was my understanding that no one should be made to feel like an insider or an outsider in the university or any of its units, depending on one's views about abortion and anything related to that topic. No one should be counted as orthodox or heretical in the Madison Program or in any other department or program of the university for his or her views, whatever they happen to be. We are a university, an academic institution, not a political party or a church or the secular ideological equivalent of a church. Although I have no objections, quite the contrary, to religiously affiliated universities, Princeton is not such a university, and has not been one for a very long time. We are a non-sectarian institution. Our mission does not include the propagation of certain beliefs. At Princeton, or so I thought, our role is to provide, in the words of our president, Christopher Eisgruber, in a statement that he put out yesterday or the day before, quote, an impartial forum for vigorous, high-quality discussion, debate, scholarship, and teaching, unquote. To me, an impartial forum means that as a faculty member or a student, I am to engage with others on controversial questions in a robust, civil, truth-seeking manner without the university or a department or program's thumb on the scales. But perhaps I was wrong. Recently, we have seen leaders of some units of our university and other universities across the country putting out statements formally committing the units they lead to particular positions on issues of precisely the sort upon which reasonable people disagree, here at Princeton and at every other university around the country. In the wake of the Dobbs decision, for example, certain units of our own university put out statements like the one I could have put out but did not put out and didn't even consider putting out, the only difference being that they condemned rather than praised the Dobbs decision and praised rather than condemned the decision that it overturned. So were they right to do so? Am I wrong to believe that neither they nor I should have committed our units of the university to a particular view? Am I misguided in thinking, along with President Eisgruber, that our duty is to provide an impartial forum for vigorous, high-quality debates? As I said to our provost, I'm happy to play by the rules, but I need to know what the rules are. And there must be one set of rules for everybody, not different rules for different people, depending on the substantive, political, moral, or other beliefs they happen to hold, or which happen to be dominant in their units. Now, let me be clear, our purpose today in gathering is not to debate abortion or Roe versus Wade or any other moral or political or constitutional question or controversy, but to ask precisely whether the right policy for non-sectarian universities like ours is for these universities and their units to take official positions on issues, or, in line with the University of Chicago's Kalven Report, to refrain from doing so. Which of those two policies, if either, supports or comports with, and which, if either, undermines and imperils the university's mission? To help us think our way through the issue, we will begin this morning with a panel of distinguished scholars representing a spectrum of disciplines in the arts and sciences. Appearing with us by electronic magic is William B. Allen. Professor Allen is Emeritus Professor of Political Philosophy in the Department of Political Science and Emeritus Dean of James Madison College at Michigan State University. He's served on the National Council for the Humanities as Chairman of the United States Commission on Civil Rights and as Executive Director of the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia. I'm proud to say that I taught his two extraordinary children, Professor Danielle Allen of Harvard and attorney Mark Allen, when they were students at Princeton. Shep Melnick is the Thomas P. O'Neill Professor of American Politics at Boston College and co-chair of the Harvard Program on Constitutional Government. He writes on issues of law, politics, and public policy. Richard Schwader is a cultural anthropologist and the Harold Higgins Swift Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. He has made contributions to the study of moral psychology in liberal and illiberal societies. His current research examines the scope and limits of tolerance of cultural diversity in Western liberal democracies. My colleague Stanley Katz is President Emeritus of the American Council of Learned Societies and Director of Princeton University's Center for Arts and Cultural Policy Studies. He previously served as the class of 1921 Bicentennial Professor of the History of American Law and Liberty here at Princeton. Dr. Katz is former president of both the Organization of American Historians and the American Society for Legal History. He is a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Society of American Historians, and a recipient of the National Humanities Medal. Anna Krylov is a professor of chemistry at the University of Southern California. Born and raised in Donetsk, Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, she is a quantum chemist working on theoretical treatments of open shell and electronically excited species. She has received numerous awards for her research, including the Plyler Prize for Molecular Spectroscopy and Dynamics. She's an elected member of the International Academy of Quantum Molecular Science and Academia Europea. She's also a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance and a member of its Academic Leadership Committee. Finally, before turning to Dr. Allen for the first presentation, please know that this conference is being live streamed. Feel free to tell your friends and colleagues to view the event live and online at mediacentrallive.princeton.edu. That is mediacentrallive.princeton.edu. And with that, I have the pleasure of turning it over by electronic magic to Dr. Bill Allen. Dr. Allen?
Good morning, and thanks to my hosts, Professors George and Wilson, and the team of the James Madison Program. I appreciate the opportunity to join the discussion of the important subject of academic freedom, on which they have provided admirable leadership. I hope the remarks offered here may advance the work they so ably undertake by casting a backward glance in order to record how we have come to this moment of controversy and to identify a foothold on which we may discover a foundation that can serve beyond the present generation. The original Kalven Report, which we hold in review, characterizes the university as a dual entity, the one living within itself the life of unimpaired inquiry, the other living in the world beyond as a corporate citizen. That very sensible observation nevertheless opened a very large can of worms, for it left it entirely a matter of discretion just what forms of corporate responsibility legitimately burdened the university. That is doubtless the reason George Stigler held out with a simpler formulation that says, in effect, the university as corporate citizen must respect its lawful obligations, but it should in no way foster any moral or political values. But the question raised in this manner is precisely whether there actually is a Caesar's wife posture available to the university. To understand the nature of this dilemma, I turn to the more recently issued Chicago statement that addresses a similar issue. The Chicago statement also forswears any and all inhibition upon robust inquiry and discussion. Nevertheless, it notes that there might arise such conduct and expressions as is incompatible with the functioning of the university. But it dismisses that observation as a minor cavil, tacitly noting that the university as an institution must make that decision for itself, while yet affirming that individual members of the university community are free to decide for themselves whether to applaud or contest ideas and behaviors. However, there's nowhere to be found a mechanism whereby these two discretionary and autonomous functions shall necessarily be harmonized or at least coordinated. Hence, the question remains, as in the Kalven Report, just how far the writ of open inquiry runs in the face of corporate imperatives. These questions regularly recur. The Chicago statement, perhaps knowingly, underscores this point by framing its discussion as recurring throughout its history roughly once every 30 years, or every generation. It would seem that the issue will not go away. What is at stake, therefore, is less the formal question of the conditions of free inquiry than the far more practical question of the apt response to demands. The notable capitulations of university administrators to threaten an actual violence in the 1960s amply illustrated how thin is the shield of intellectual independence. But universities themselves cultivate the invasions of their independence through careless assumption of the power to direct, the larger course of society, which is to say, they regard themselves as educating the society and not merely the community members within the universities. And that is particularly relevant with respect to the development of the anti-racism crusade. Before the current rage emerged, I anticipated its ill effects with an analysis of university responses to what in that age of innocence was called political correctness. In the process, I even introduced the term inclusion in 2007 in a bootless effort to oppose the concept of the university to diversity. I failed in that endeavor for the sufficient reason that the universities were already well in the thrall of the next generational challenge to intellectual independence. Universities set the tone for all public and corporate practice in the case of affirmative action, preferences, and diversity. For that reason, I present the special case of the university. Everyone in higher education is first engaged in and committed to serving the cause of robust intellectual development, even when some lose sight of that goal in the course of pursuing policy. Here, I refocus university admissions on the core pursuit of truth in circumstances of open-ended inquiry. I assume that informed observers recognize the intrinsic connection between the mission of the university and the character of the community such a mission will foster. We should expect community members, students, and faculty from a broad range of backgrounds, each contributing in special ways to fuel open-ended inquiry. I raise the question, however, whether this fundamental assumption is adequately expressed in the language we employ when describing our work in higher education. In a word, equity has banished fairness, which alone ever gave meaning to the term equity. Would it not be good to make clear that whatever these terms mean, they must be understood in relation to the core mission of higher education? I at least think that is so. For that reason, I draw out the mind picture of the university that pursues truth in circumstances of open-ended inquiry. It is certainly such an one as attracts the participation of able and engaged students and faculty recognized for their intellectual potential before they're characterized by their respective religious, racial, ethnic, gender, or similar backgrounds. Moreover, it is critical that exertions be undertaken to build a broadly constituted university in the interest of providing the most favorable opportunity to realize the core mission. Success in the pursuit of truth hinges on attracting the most able seekers, and nothing, no element of background, nor extraneous identification, should interfere with making a clear commitment to attracting such seekers. Therefore, I distinguish the terms we use: multiculturalism, diversity, inclusion, with an eye to underscoring the goal we have in mind, which is to build common participation in and appreciation for the life of the mind and the benefits of learning. Therefore, I privilege the language of inclusion above the other terms as clearer in effect and intention. And similarly, I urge that we avoid over-reliance upon non-academic staff to implement these principles, but turn instead to persons who are capable of showing due deference and respect for the purpose of the university. Most importantly, though, we should replace separationist policies with policies that integrate community members and that rely upon self-motivation as the first principle of selection. Nothing is more important than to communicate to community members and prospective community members that it is they and not university officers who determine their own fates. And this is where I would end if I had no more to say than that which emerges from appraising the Kalven Report and the subsequent Chicago Statement. But there is a larger work to be done, and in the remarks I've prepared on this occasion, I have gone at greater length into the symphony and not just the sonata, discussing how we got to be in this circumstance and what are the required steps we might take to emerge from it, if not unscathed, at least restored. And I trust in the ensuing conversation, some of these observations can play a role in amplifying the general sentiments that are to be expressed on this occasion. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Professor Melnick.
Should I do it from here?
Sure, whatever you prefer.
Thanks. Like all of you, I'm here today because I'm deeply concerned about threats to free speech and free inquiry on the campus. These threats come from many places. They come from students, they come from administrators, they come from federal regulators, they come from state governments, they come from social media, they come from faculty members, they come from the left, and they come from the right. The Kalven Report reminds us, now quote, "The mission of the university is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. A university must sustain an extraordinary environment of freedom of inquiry and maintain independence from political passions, and pressures." Absolutely. I would guess that we all agree with that. At the same time, though, I think that the standard of the neutrality of the institution, of the university as an institution, provides an inadequate basis for that much-needed defense. I'm going to range a little bit beyond some of the questions Professor George raised at the beginning in order to help us assess whether this standard neutrality is sufficient. And I have 4 points I want to make briefly. The first is that the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge might be the central mission of the University of Chicago, but it is not the central or even the primary mission of many institutions of higher education. I teach at a Jesuit institution that stresses the importance of what is called student formation. Now, many people in the university think that student formation means promoting Catholicism. I don't think anyone in my department thinks so. As a matter of fact, I don't think we have any practicing Catholics. But we do believe that part of student formation is promoting student commitment to help other people. For us, that means inculcating civic spiritedness and civic engagement. I just visited Claremont McKenna College in Southern California, and their central mission is to promote leadership and civic engagement. Historically, black colleges and universities have the goal of improving the material, spiritual, and intellectual development of those who have suffered from years of discrimination and mistreatment. And to be honest, most colleges, especially community colleges, have the mission of providing jobs to their students. To defend these goals, I think, is completely appropriate. Second, we might deplore, but we can't ignore, the fact that our universities have become what Clark Kerr called the multiversity. They include not just collections of scholars, but huge, expensive, externally funded science labs. Research centers devoted to everything from the study of systematic racism to the discovery of extraterrestrial life. And let us not forget those athletic teams that define and corrupt so many of our colleges. All schools have large and growing numbers of so-called student-facing administrators who do God knows what. And I'm quite disturbed about that. And they all have admissions offices that are responsible for determining who gets in, and thus, in the long run, the shape of student culture. Lately, I've been barraged by emails from Harvard University defending its admissions policy. I keep looking for some reference to the Stewart's work, but I don't find any in Harvard's discussion of these issues. I find these annoying and often misleading, but I don't question Harvard's right to defend its admissions process. The big point I want to make here is that universities make hundreds, even thousands of politically laden decisions about how to increase and how to spend their considerable resources. They are very rich, very powerful institutions, and in many of these contexts, neutrality doesn't have any concrete meaning. Third point, as Jonathan Rauch has emphasized in his important work, The Constitution of Knowledge, universities are a central component of the modern post-Enlightenment liberal order. It cannot be neutral on the survival of that liberal order any more than it can be neutral on the survival of free speech and inquiry. It must be prepared to defend the liberal order from enemies, both foreign, today especially China, and domestic, today both the extreme right and the extreme left. Thus, a central purpose of the university should be to produce citizens and leaders who can thoughtfully debate public issues and who understand both the enormous benefits conveyed by this liberal order as well as its limitations. This is a political commitment, not neutrality. One way to do this, of course, is to provide examples of what civil, serious, in-depth discussion of controversial issues entails. Some schools have done this well, most of them exceedingly poorly. Even more important is to teach students how to think critically, evaluate evidence, and express themselves clearly on political issues. This means expecting students to move beyond facile slogans like white supremacy and the deep state to explore what it means, what the causes of inequality are, and who governs in the modern welfare state. They need, in short, a political education. Obviously, I'm a political scientist, so this serves my occupational interest. And finally, and partly at odds with what I just said about defending the liberal order, universities must tolerate, protect, and even encourage students to probe and question the foundations of this liberal order. A good university is not a safe space for anyone. Remember, though, that Athens put Socrates, the Kalven Report states, quote, "A good university, like Socrates, will be upsetting." Absolutely. But we should remember that Athens put Socrates to death for questioning the gods of the city and the authority of Athens. That doesn't seem to upset the elderly Socrates, but suffering the fate of Socrates should upset some of us who work in universities and value their existence. We don't want universities to drink the hemlock. Good teaching and great scholarship will sometimes be subversive. While defending the liberal order, the university must also teach its critics, ranging from Plato and Aquinas to Nietzsche and Foucault. But here the university must be more prudent than Socrates. Those it hires and those it grants respectability to are not standing on soapboxes in Hyde Park, and even that's true at the University of Chicago. We have a responsibility not just to respect professional norms, but to show respect for a political order that grants them such remarkable freedom and such remarkable privileges. Is my final point at odds with my first point about defending the liberal order? Yes, it is. But I'm moderately confident that when our students compare the most serious critiques of liberal democracy with its most serious defenders, they will side with the liberal order. But in short, I will just close with this, we need to admit that our diverse institutions of higher learning do not have one easily identifiable telos, but several that often conflict with one another. Consequently, our task, however important, cannot be captured by a short description of political neutrality. Perhaps by the end of the day, we'll come up with a more adequate formulation, but at least let's hope we can begin to move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Schwader.
I can see there's going to be a lot of overlap and perhaps interesting points of difference. I'm only speaking about, there are many types of academies. I'm going to be speaking about one type, and one I think is worth preserving. I wouldn't imagine that the neutrality principle should apply across the board to every type of academy. The University of Chicago Kalven Report is a unique policy document written in 1967. It gave voice to a conception of what might be called classical liberalism's academia. In classical liberalism's academia, the preeminent value is academic freedom or freedom of thought. In that classical liberal conception, academic freedom is preeminent in the sense that it should never be balanced or traded off against other values. It is not merely one value among the several that give character to any particular university community. I think it is noteworthy that in recent decades that preeminent value of classical liberalism has been taken over, or at the very least balanced, against alternative values that come out of the contemporary liberal state, which is not necessarily a classically liberal state. And those are now competing in ways that are corrosive of this preeminent notion of academic freedom. What is academic freedom for? Classical liberalism's answer, given by many, is that the purpose of academic freedom is to protect the ardor and fearlessness of scholars to follow the argument where it leads, unfettered of received wisdom and popular views, and regardless of the practical, social, or moral implications of their conclusions. Instead of putting Socrates on trial, we welcome him to the halls of the academy, protect him, encourage members of the community to engage him in argument, and guarantee him the exceptional right to upset young minds and the minds of the elders as well, those who ultimately want to put him to death. In 1967, the Kalven Report was a voice from out of one of the country's classically liberal academic institutions, not a sectarian one, not one committed to a particular moral vision for their students. It bore a resemblance of sorts to the 1930s articulation by University of Chicago President Robert Maynard Hutchins, who defined the idea of a university this way, quote, "A university is a community of scholars. It is not a kindergarten. It is not a club. It is not a reform school. It's not a political party. It's not an agency of propaganda. A university is a community of scholars." Today, in many ways, universities operate like kindergartens, clubs, moral reform schools, political parties, and so forth. And that is part of the problem, and understanding how that's come about is something we need to get into deeply. Hutchins was not the only University of Chicago president to embrace classical liberalism's conception of the academy. In 1967, the very year that the Kalven Report was written, Edward Levy, the then president of the university, told the Citizens Board of the University of Chicago that it's not the role of the university to directly respond to the needs of the broader worlds of politics and commerce, or to be popular with the general public, and that the true mission of an academic institution is intellectual, not moral. He told them that the university does not exist to develop inventions for industry, or to be a pipeline and train technicians for society, or to counter the injustices of the world. The central purpose of the university, Levy avowed, the main reason for its existence is, quote, "improving the stock of ordered knowledge and rational judgment." University presidents, you may have noticed, no longer speak that way, not even at the University of Chicago. Many of them have concluded that Levy's vision of the academy is both unaffordable and impractical, and they have more or less opened the gates of the academy to diverse interest groups with political, moral, and commercial missions of their own. Levy was describing the classical liberal conception of the academy. As far as I know, the enrichment concept and the motto of the university, Crescat Scientia Vita Escalator, let knowledge increase so life may be enriched, was never meant to imply go to college so that you can get rich, or go to college so you can save the world. Nor was the adage meant to imply that the aim of the university was to engage in beneficent social engineering or quote-unquote urban wealth creation or human rights activism or identity politics. Nevertheless, those motives are increasingly part of the contemporary postmodern multiverse discourse used to justify public and private support for the academy, as many universities strive to become consulting agencies of sort, setting up urban labs or innovation institutes to collaborate with non-academic change agents, so-called change agents, for example, politicians, entrepreneurs, and non-governmental organizations, and targeting their fundraising efforts and even their mission statements to projected practical advances in the production of energy, school reform, environmental protection, and health-enhancing discoveries and inventions in microbiology and molecular engineering. It was during that very year when Edward Levy envisioned the classical liberal academy as a temple of critical reason that the University of Chicago Kalven Committee report was written. The dual and mutually reinforcing principles of institutional neutrality and faculty and student intellectual autonomy were made explicit, and that policy statement became the basis for some highly visible refusals of the university as an institution to endorse political positions or engage in collective social action. In all those cases, the war in Vietnam, apartheid in South Africa, the civil war and violence in Darfur, and more recently the call for boycotts and divestment with regard to Israel and Israeli academic institutions, there was widespread student and faculty concern about the gravity of those situations. In all four cases, many members of the community personally felt something must be done to rectify the situation. Some members of the university community organized and lobbied to enlist the Board of Trustees of the university to officially and publicly take a political stand or to engage in actions of one sort or another, such as divestment. And in each case, the administrative leaders of the university defended its core academic mission, pointed to the Kalven Report, and remained committed to a no-comment institutional neutrality principle, which bars the institution and all its administrators, including deans and chairs of departments, institutes, and centers, from speaking on behalf of the community as a whole, while fiercely protecting, the rights of individual faculty members and students to speak for themselves. This is how the Kalven Committee Report describes the fundamental aim of a free academic institution. Quote, "A university faithful to its mission will provide enduring challenges to social values, policies, practices, and institutions. By design and by effect, it's the institution which creates discontent with the existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. In brief, a good university, like Socrates, will be upsetting." Jeffrey Stone, a well-known legal scholar of the First Amendment, who was once the Harry Kalven Chair at the university, now is the Edward Levy Chair at the university, former dean of our law school and former provost of the university, and author of the so-called Chicago Principles, invoked the Kalven Committee Report to defend the university's embrace of a neutrality principle with respect to the civil war in the Sudan. He offered that defense despite the fact that as a student, he, like I, had strong feelings of the opposite kind. That would be during the time of the student unrest on college campuses in the late 1960s when the Kalven Committee Report was written, and when many of us thought we had to do something, and one of the things we mistakenly thought we had to do was get our universities to condemn the war in Vietnam. We did find alternative ways to express our political views. Stone described the Darfur decision in some of the following terms. Quote, "What the Kalven Report forbids are decisions of the university designed expressly or symbolically to proclaim right moral, political, or social positions." Of course, there are degrees of right and wrong and degrees of evil. This is his voice. But it is not the role of the university to take positions on such questions. Indeed, the university should no more divest in such a case than it should prohibit students and faculty from speaking freely on campus in support of tobacco subsidies, the moral legitimacy of murdering abortionists, the right of Palestinians to destroy Israel, or even the morality of genocide. He goes on to conclude his reflection, which appeared in the University of Chicago Law School blog, as by noting, quote, "The role of the university is not to decide such questions, but to create and nurture an environment in which we may freely and openly debate them without fearing that the university has already resolved them on our behalf," end quote. He might just as well have said, in effect, by means of his provocative and indignation-arousing examples, he did say it. In brief, a good university, like Socrates, will be upsetting. Intellectual life in such a free-thinking institution may be contentious, frustrating, and upsetting, but if the institution itself wishes to remain true to its central mission, it won't take sides. Let me conclude by drawing your attention to the following paragraph in the Kalven Report, a paragraph which, in my view, has received insufficient attention and analysis, and which I would like to suggest presents a very large challenge for anyone attempting to write Kalven 2.0 in 2022 in the era of the multiverse described earlier. This is post-1972, when Congress started the whole human subjects protection movement, resulting in the IRB and the role it now plays in licensing research at universities. It's post-1978 and the Bakke decision, which opened the door to beneficent educational environments, which in my view have been abused to actually serve other political goals, which are really what's behind the affirmative action movement, and that is to make up for slavery in one way or another. which was actually ruled out in the Bakke decision. It's post-1980 when the Bayh-Dole statute was passed by Congress, which opened up all sorts of commercial possibilities for universities and have introduced profit motives which were prohibited explicitly in the University of Statutes prior to that point. And here's the quote. This is the relevant paragraph. From time to time, instances will arise in which the society or segments of it threaten the very mission of the university. Shep was, I think, mentioned this indirectly, and its values of free inquiry. In such a crisis, it becomes the obligation of the university as an institution to oppose such measures and actively to defend its interests and its values. There's another context in which questions as to the appropriate role of the university may possibly arise, situations involving university ownership of property. Just listen to this list. The receipt of funds, its awarding of honors, its membership in other organizations. Here, of necessity, the university, however it acts, must act as an institution in its corporate capacity. For example, on July 31st, 2007, Robert Zimmer, then president of the University of Chicago, sent a message to Ms. Sally Hunt, Secretary General of the United Kingdom's University and College Union, where they were about to propose a potential boycott of Israeli academic institutions. And he came out quite clearly and powerfully denouncing that, calling for them to withdraw from it. Here we have the University of Chicago committed to the Kalven Report, believing it was perfectly appropriate to say something about another country's behavior, not something directly affecting the University of Chicago, but speaking to our preeminent value. We have lots of values. We didn't get involved in discrimination during apartheid in South Africa. Why not? Okay, given the door that gets opened once you start doing what we did here with regard to academic freedom values and the exchange of scholars. So that issue has to be faced. How wide do we want that door to be, especially in a world in which all sorts of things are coming at universities, which one way or another affect their mission? Can we now actively speak to Congress about not passing Bayh-Dole because of the commercialization effect it might have, and so forth and so on? On the other side, how narrow do we want, how expansive do we want the application of neutrality? Let's take the giving of awards and honors. The provost's office at the University of Chicago every year now gives awards to leaders, whether they're alums or members of our community, who, quote unquote, promote social justice and equality in society. Imagine the University of Chicago coming out with a statement saying, we applaud the efforts going on now to gerrymander congressional districts so that we can create a minority-majority district. They would never say that. It would be prohibited clearly by the Kalven Report. How about, however, when they give a diversity leadership award, they give it to a prominent person who is promoting exactly that kind of action? What distinction do we want to try or not try to draw between those two kinds of cases? We're opening a huge conversation here, if you're truly committed to institutional neutrality, about statements, direct or indirect, the university is making through its institutional actions. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Katz.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I regret I can't be here all day, and I'm sorry about that. But I actually want to be a wet blanket, and much of the problem with a panel like this is that we don't coordinate, and so I agree almost entirely with what Shep has said, and with a great deal of what Rick has said. But I'll say it again in my own way. I think the basic problem is the one that Rick referred to, which is that this is really a kind of University of Chicago, Princeton conference. That's fine. I've been a member of both of those communities, and I admire both of those communities. But as Shep said, that's not all American universities, and that's not all. So that's not all universities. I'm going to come back to that point. That's point one. Point two is that this is being dealt with, and this is certainly appropriate in a university context, as a matter of principle. As a matter of principle, I think I agree entirely with everything we've been sent, and I'm sure I'll agree with whatever it is that's decided upon at the end. But I don't live in a world which is exclusively driven by principle. I live in a much more three-dimensional world, and I don't think a focused statement simply on principles takes us very far. I was, by the way, and to go back to this, of course, I consider myself very much a University of Chicago type. I was only there for 7 years, but it really spoke to much that I care most about in intellectual life and in university life. And my appointment there was actually not in the history department, although I was a member of the history department. It was in the law school, where I was part, by the way, of a pronounced political minority. That is to say, I was a liberal in a dominantly conservative institution. And by the way, that was not a casual conservatism. We could talk about that later if you wanted, but it was part of the University of Chicago, and it was a very important part of the University of Chicago. It was, by the way, a very important part of my personal education because I had lived too long in an exclusively liberal environment. I came away from that, I think, a different and better person. I won't say more about that. But also, the University of Chicago, as Rick at the end said, has a pretty mixed record when it comes to all of this. I mean, he mentioned a more recent example of all this. I mentioned to him when we first sat down, what I remember most profoundly was when my friend and my first history teacher, Hannah Gray, awarded the first Pick Prize to Robert McNamara, who was then the president of the World Bank. And I think, in fact, Rick and I were both among the protesters against that award. I don't know, I can't speak for Rick. I was protesting not so much that the university was giving such an award, but I thought that Robert McNamara was an inappropriate person to receive it. Those old friends of mine who decided to award him the prize thought they were awarding it to him as the leader of the World Bank, not as the Secretary of Defense, but it's one person, and he did both things. I won't say more about that, and you can think of many other examples of that kind. So that's a lead into the problem, and I would urge us to think about this as a more complex and indeed more sociological rather than philosophical sort of problem. Because here I agree entirely with Shep, and that is there are many kinds of universities. They have many different functions. I don't think you have to go to the concept of multiversity to explain it. It's been true in many places over a very long period of time. And there, for me, the more powerful example is not, I did spend 7 years at the University of Chicago, but I spent the same amount of time at the University of Wisconsin, where I taught in the history department prior to going to Chicago. And that's a very different kind of university. And you all know this presumably, but I want to remind you of the Wisconsin idea. The Wisconsin idea is simply that the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state of Wisconsin. And what counts for the Wisconsin idea is that the university has the mission of touching every person in the state. Now, that couldn't be more different than what Rick is describing, and what, for instance, we think here at Princeton, or what Rick and colleagues think at the University of Chicago. They're different kinds of universities, but Wisconsin is still a great university. Wisconsin is still committed to the life of the mind and to the production of knowledge. Although I must say that there's a difference there, because I would say that Wisconsin is more a Ben Franklin sort of university, committed to the production of useful knowledge. And that's a distinction that's worth thinking about in all of this. In other words, it's not knowledge in an unqualified kind of way. Obviously, I could say a lot more about that, and I'm not going to do it. But I'd also like to say that, a few of you know this, my closest friend at the University of Chicago was Harry Kalven. It was my first experience in law teaching, and Harry was very much my mentor as a law teacher, and I couldn't have got through the experience without him. I'll tell you only two stories. He asked me to teach a course at one point, sort of advanced torts. We didn't have such a course in the curriculum at that time. And it was really essentially a course about dignitary harm. It was really an interesting aspect of the law, and there was a lot of new development at that time. And I said, fine. And I said, well, what should I call it? The torts 2 or dignitary torts? And Harry said, well, let me think about it. And the next time we had lunch, he said, I got a title for the course. And that is the title we used. It was The Redress of Certain Harms. Now, that could only have been done, I think, at the University of Chicago. Students signed up anyway, and I taught dignitary harms. But it was. The other naming experience I had there was Harry and Owen Fiss and I, for 5 or 6 years, gave a seminar on the law of slavery. It was a very important moment for us, and there's at least one member of this audience who was a member of that seminar while he was at the University of Chicago. So I went to the dean, Phil Neal, and asked for permission to teach such a course. He said, it's a great idea. We would love to have it. But what I'd given him a piece of paper and said the title of the seminar was The Law of Slavery. He said, the University of Chicago cannot offer a course on the law of slavery. It will sound as though we are advertising the institution. And he said, don't worry about it, I'll think of a title. And he did. So for 5 years we gave a seminar, and you probably don't know what the name of the seminar you took was, but it was Government Regulation of Race Relations 1. Only at the University of Chicago. It was a great title. But I hope you get the point that I am making here. But Harry was an extraordinary person. And I think it's important, and I'm not going to try to give a speech about Harry's views on the First Amendment, but what was core to his thinking about it has been quoted a million times in the materials we've got. Comes from New York Times versus Sullivan, and it's that speech, the function of speech really is to be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. And Harry himself took a very empirical and sociological view of law. He wasn't primarily a scholar of principle. And if you read his book, I think you would see that. And don't forget the title. The title is A Worthy Tradition. It's not a principle, it's a tradition. And he saw that as a tradition which evolved over a period of time. And I think that's really an important aspect of what Harry thought. And by the way, also in terms of his own scholarship, he was an empirical scholar. His biggest achievement really was not the First Amendment book, which was really written by his son and Owen Fiss after he died, but it was the production of the volume on the criminal jury in America. And this is the first empirical work on the jury in this country. It was actually a triumph of empirical legal research. Later, for various reasons, turned out to be one that couldn't be followed up. So I want to remember that part of Harry and of his approach to all of this. So I'll come to the end of what I wanted to say by giving the text that I'm talking from. And when I wrote this down, I had two texts in mind. One was one you're very familiar with. Well, you're familiar with both. It was from Martin Luther King, and simply his much-quoted statement that we shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Now, it's a little hard to know exactly what Dr. King meant by that, and it's been interpreted in a very liberal sort of way, but it's a very complicated statement. And after all, it's not his. It was a phrase taken from Theodore Parker, the great minister in the late 19th century, who I think meant something quite different by it. But the other one that came to mind is simply from my favorite 17th century English poet, whom I studied when I was an undergraduate, and that is John Donne. And it's, again, you all know the poem, but I'll remind you. No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of thy friends or of thy own there. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. I think that's the right attitude for what we're talking about here. The university is a part of the society. The university can't. It's not an ivory tower, although it has those aspects. Even the University of Chicago and Princeton are part of society. Other universities proclaim themselves, like the University of Wisconsin, to be organically part of society. So I think the questions we need to ask really is, how can we continue to produce knowledge, to foster debate and inquiry in a way that is both faithful to ourselves as scholars and is responsible to the citizens of a democracy. If we frame the question in that way, I think we may come to some rather different conclusions.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Professor Krylov.
I too believe that institutional neutrality is absolutely essential. I would like to explain my position through the lens of my life experiences. I grew up behind the Iron Curtain in the USSR. When the curtain came down in 1991, we fled to Israel. It felt unreal. It was like falling out.
And can you speak more loudly and closer to the microphone? It's not picking up. Can you please turn the volume up a little? Thank you.
It felt unreal. It was like falling out of a muted black and white movie into a world full of colors and sounds. It was dazzling. The bright colors of the Mediterranean, the profusion of foods, flavors, and sounds. And of course, people. I had never seen so many different types of people. People of European, American, Russian, Iraqi, Iranian, Ethiopian, and dozens of other descents. They looked different. They dressed differently. They ate different foods. But they smiled to each other, and they worked together. The community at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where I enrolled into a PhD program, was a cross-section of the Israeli society, supplemented with a good number of international scholars. It was an intellectually dazzling experience to engage with so many different worldviews, beliefs, and ideas. This was especially invigorating after the rigid monoculture of Soviet Russia, where everyone kowtowed to the party line. My colleagues at the Hebrew University had vastly different beliefs about the world. Some were Orthodox Jews and some card-carrying atheists. They held a vast spectrum of political views. Many were actively participating in local politics. Yet, when we were at the university, we worked together, united by a common goal, the pursuit of truth. We were a community of scholars doing what scholars are supposed to do, producing and disseminating knowledge. Our cultural, religious, or political disagreements did not affect our behavior in the lab. Nobody felt excluded or intimidated because of his or her viewpoint. And that was possible because of the neutrality of the university. The university did not have an official religion or an official political affiliation. The university was focused on its mission, the pursuit of truth. I do not know whether the Hebrew University had an official guidance document similar to the Kalven Report, but it functioned by these principles. That was in contrast to the USSR, where every institution had to profess its alliance with Marxist-Leninist ideology, and where the goal of advancing the world revolution took priority over any professional duty. When I came to the US in the late 90s, I was similarly impressed by the culture of professionalism in American universities and in industry. We came from all over the world with strongly different opinions on many issues, but when we worked on chemistry, we worked on chemistry. Leaving our politics and religion out of the lab, we could move mountains. Today, however, professionalism is compromised. Professional spaces are now used to promote various political causes, damaging our ability to work together. Companies, big and small, engage in political activism. Barbers post BLM posters in their windows. Uber Eats makes politically motivated vendor suggestions to customers. Scientific journals, such as Nature, endorse presidential candidates, and professional societies opine about current events. And the universities are not immune to that. Regretfully, the universities are leading this cultural shift. In his Atlantic piece describing the cultural fragmentation of our society, Jonathan Haidt uses the analogy of the Tower of Babel. Allowing political agendas to interfere with our professional lives prevents us from working together towards a common goal. The Kalven Report says, to perform its mission in the society, a university must sustain an extraordinary environment of freedom of inquiry and maintain an independence from political fashions, passions, and pressures. It further explains, it is a community which cannot take collective action on the issues of the day without endangering the conditions for its existence and effectiveness. The Kalven Report also explains that when the university or any other professional institution takes a position on an issue, it amounts to suppressing dissent and censoring minority opinions. It says, there is no mechanism by which it can reach a collective position without inhibiting that full freedom of dissent on which it thrives. It cannot insist that all of its members favor a given view of social policy. If it takes collective action, therefore it does so at the price of censoring any minority who do not agree with the view adopted. In brief, it is a community which cannot resort to majority vote to reach positions on public issues. The clear recommendation of the Kalven Report is that the university must stay neutral. The nature of the cause does not matter. It is the principle of neutrality. Consider the war in Ukraine. In my eyes, Ukraine is on the right side of history and Russia is on the wrong side. I am horrified by Putin's war crimes against the civilian population. My heart is broken as I am thinking of my friends and relatives caught in this nightmare. Yet, I would not want my university to issue a statement condemning the war, even if the majority, including me, agrees with this. Why? Because it's not the university business to take sides in international affairs. Because there is no way to establish that all faculty, students, and staff would agree with such a statement. Because if today the university were to issue a statement on this war, what would prevent it from issuing a statement on another war, in which right and wrong might be not so clear-cut? How will the university decide when to take a position and which one? When to speak up and what to say? I'm convinced that it is much better for the university to remain silent. In addition, when the university violates the principle of neutrality and takes collective action on various political causes, it undermines its ability to fulfill its bigger role in the society. One of such roles is providing a pool of subject matter experts to advise citizens and policymakers. The effectiveness of the university in this role depends on public trust, and this trust is now greatly diminished. The Pew Research Center reported that in 2015, 63% of Americans saw universities as having a positive effect on the society, and 28% as negative. In 2019, only 50% of Americans viewed the universities as having a positive effect, and 38% as negative. This is a significant decline in public trust. Research by Professor Kahan from Harvard provides an explanation to that phenomenon, widespread mistrust in science. Kahan shows that public acceptance of a scientific consensus is driven not by scientific literacy, but by political ideology and trust in scientific institutions. His data show that, contrary to popular belief, acceptors are no more knowledgeable or more educated than deniers. However, when people perceive a certain issue as politicized, and when they perceive the institutions as actors engaging in promoting a particular political or ideological agenda, then they mistrust scientific facts. Thus, to restore trust in the institutions of higher education, to restore trust in science, the universities must abandon political activism and restore their neutrality. The closing statement of the Kalven Report says, "Our basic conviction is that a great university can perform greatly for the betterment of society. It should not, therefore, permit itself to be diverted from its mission into playing the role of a second-rate political force or influence." In closing, I would like to bring up a few points to consider in our conversation. The Kalven Report is beautifully written, and its recommendations remain relevant today. However, I am concerned about one paragraph. From time to time, instances will arise in which the society or segments of it threaten the very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry. In such a crisis, it becomes the obligation of the university as an institution to oppose such measures and actively to defend its interests and its values. I agree with the spirit of this, but I worry about its vagueness. How do we decide when there is such a crisis? Is electing a politician who argues against tenure threaten the mission of the university? Does an imminent war represent a sufficient threat to abandon neutrality? What about civil unrest? I do not know. Perhaps never would be a much easier directive to follow than except in the time of crisis. The second issue is tactical. How can we persuade our universities to adopt this principle? And once adopted, how do we get them to enforce it? Even at the University of Chicago, there have been numerous instances of departments posting various political statements. I learned that a group of faculty worked with the administration to develop a procedure for reporting violations of the Kalven Report, and that after 2 years of effort, they managed to get the statements taken down. Can we make policy recommendations that will help to streamline this process? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Very good. Before we open the floor for questions, let me just ask if any of the panelists have anything to say to each other. Any comments in view of each other's comments so far? Yes, Nadine Strawson, first question.
Thank
Nadine,
you.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Do you want to stand up so we can see
Sure.
it? Yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much, Robbie, and the panel, including our virtual panelists. It was really, they were all really terrific remarks. My question is for you, Rick. I understand from Brian Leiter's blog, and I believe from conversations with you as well, that there is a group at the University of Chicago that protests whenever the Kalven principles are at least arguably deviated from. Is that correct? And could you bring us up to date on what the procedures are and what the results have been?
I suppose it could be characterized as a protest group, although I don't think that's our central identity. I think there is a subset of perhaps now 50 faculty who are on a listserv and have fairly regular exchanges. Not everyone's participating at any moment. There are some people who are more active. It arose, I believe, in the wake of Dorian Abbott's experience. For those of you who don't know,
Can you unmute?
a member of our faculty, tenured faculty member in the geophysics department, became concerned about the way a particular search for faculty was operating, and in very public ways defended meritocracy as the only standard that should operate in hiring in their department. He ultimately wrote a op-ed piece in, I think it was in Newsweek, that got a lot of attention, and this ultimately resulted in the cancellation of a lecture he had been invited to give at MIT, which produced its own conversation. But in any case, his activities talking about meritocracy at the University of Chicago resulted in a petition signed by postdocs, students, calling on the president of the university to sanction him for saying this. Bob Zimmer, who was the president, then put out a statement without naming Dorian, suggesting that we don't sanction people for the views they have at the University of Chicago, and faculty and students are free to even criticize the policies of the university without sanction. In any case, out of that came this listserv and conversation. What also energized the group, and continues to, I think, was the very rapid setting aside of Kalven after George Floyd was killed, and various departments at the University of Chicago on their websites were putting out very political statements of shows of solidarity. But by the time we had the music department calling for the defunding of the police, this felt like where's the central administration? And even the provost's office was doing questionable things with regard to the relevant issues. And that then led to inviting our new president to meet with us, talk about Kalven. He's expressed very strong commitment to Kalven. He's explicitly said in one meeting that, judge me on whether I walk the walk and just don't talk the talk, so we will see. And that procedure that was referred to, which I don't think is necessarily a great way to go, was when you see a website going up that you think is a violation of the Kalven Report, then members of the faculty should inform the relevant dean and let it go from there. And there was some commitment for the provost and the president to have discussions with deans and others about what Kalven meant. And indeed, over some period of time, that procedure was followed, and those websites are down. On the other hand, it raised uncomfortable issues, because deans don't necessarily want to sit there and have faculty members tell them they haven't upheld the Kalven Report. And they also have faculty who interpret academic freedom as meaning I can do that. You're suppressing my academic freedom. And that creates another sort of level of conflict and tension within a university. So what enforcement is going to mean with Kalven is an open issue, and to the extent we're having discussions of writing this report, I think that issue has to be addressed. As far as I can tell, this is secondhand. The lawyers at the University of Chicago, I think, Kalven, from their point of view, may just be seen as this lofty principle, but enforcement? I'm not sure they even think about that or see a feasible way to do it. So, and there is something sort of disturbing. I'm disturbed at the idea of going around policing things of this type, and I think it's a real problem to figure out how to do this in the right way.
Speaking of deans, Dean Allen, can you try again? Oh, no. Bill, is it possible that you're muted on your side? It's not.
Professor, we have a question right here in the meeting.
Keep holding the thought. Yes, Mr. John Tomasi, Dr. Tomasi.
Hi, I'm John Tomasi. I'm the president of Heterodox Academy and an erstwhile professor at Brown. I have a question for Shep, but it goes to some others on the panel as well. So Shep, you mentioned different universities having different kinds of purposes, a tele approach, more than one telos. And we could even strengthen your point, I suppose, historically. There's a masterful work, some of you may know, by Frederick Rudolph, The History of the American University, which describes through time these apparently different tele that universities have held. I want to challenge that. I have a question or a challenge to that idea. It seems to me that all the different goals that you mentioned, and the ones that Frederick Rudolph mentions as well, can be reduced to the skills acquired by seeking the knowledge-seeking ideal. So the point will be kind of obvious, but I want to hear what you say to it. How do you get a high-paying job if that's your goal? How do you achieve an agricultural breakthrough if that's your goal? How do you overcome the experience of historical injustice if that's your college's goal? The best path, I suppose, is to develop skills of reasoning, of active and close reading, of organizing and expressing one's written words with power, to learn facts about history and the processes of scientific discovery, to develop an open mind that is critical and questioning. So I sort of think that reductive approach is attractive to me. I'd love to hear what you think. If you think anything I said, would you disagree with that?
Shep.
Sure, that's a great question, and I agree completely with you that primary goal of that type of education has got to be at the heart of any serious university. And but of course, the point I want to make is that in human life, in practical terms, often we find ourselves with a variety of goals that sometimes can be in contention with one another. But here's a point that I think I want to emphasize, which is when we're debating this issue about whether the university should take stands on controversial issues, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. And what we're really concerned is the way in which so many of these other commitments of the contemporary university are getting in the way of the primary one. If we thought, concerns about racial justice, should universities be concerned about racial justice? Obviously, yes. But if that conflicts with what you were just saying about the nature of the educational process, if we use that concern to get us to have overly simplified and often inaccurate ways of viewing the issue, which I think is happening every day in universities today, then we're neither serving that other goal, and we're not serving the primary goal of the university that you, I think, very well enunciated.
Professor Haeckel.
Okay, I'm Bernard Haeckel here from Princeton. My remarks actually are very similar to what Anna already presented. Both she and I come from overseas. We are, in a way, students of overseas universities where, in fact, you have very limited academic freedom. And universities, as Anna pointed out, often have to adhere to an ideology set by the state. And that creates, that stifles research, it stifles the search for truth and knowledge and the production of knowledge. And so I instinctively, I think just like Anna does, feel very allergic to a university adopting an ideological stance or a position and then trying to enforce it. And I wonder here, and this is my question, and Stan made this distinction between principle and law. And he said that Harry Kalven was a scholar of law, not just of principle. My question is that on certain matters, maybe just principle should trump the law. It should be, for prudential reasons, not least for prudential reasons, that we should just be very strict, even radical adherence of institutional neutrality because of the larger purpose that it serves our universities and our societies.
Is that for Stan?
For
anyone. Okay, yeah. Hey, Stan, please.
I'm happy to say something to that.
Yeah, just lean in. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, but this isn't the moment for talk on the sociology of law. But some of our most famous judges have spoken about the embeddedness of law in experience. And I think in general, that is the approach that certainly that I take, certainly that Harry Kalven took. There is a relationship between the principle and the lived experience. It's that relationship, I think, that's central to what we're talking about. I was trying to get in within my 8 minutes, so I didn't say the thing I most wanted to say, which is, I think a better way to think about the university, and it really is a response to this. I don't agree with that account of the university at all. I take here my lead from John Dewey, who, after all, emphasized experience. And I think if we try to separate the university from experience as a cognitive matter, we are not going to capture the essence of what the university is all about. It's tricky. Unfortunately, John Dewey wrote so poorly that I have a quotation here I could read you, but I don't think you'd understand it. I'm not sure I understand it. But the general point, I think, is clear. So that's where I would go. And I think that's what's wrong with that kind of definition. It certainly captures much of the essence, at least of certain kinds of universities. But even for those universities, it doesn't capture all of it. And I also want to remind Rick, my favorite statement of Robert Maynard Hutchins is not the one that he quoted, which is more commonly quoted, but President Hutchins addressed the faculty of the University of Chicago at the South Shore Country Club in December of 1944. It was a very unhappy speech that he made. He looked at them finally and said, "Gentlemen," they were all gentlemen, "the problem with you is that you're engaged in making molehills out of mountains." And that's worth thinking about.
Let's see if the third time is the charm. Dean Allen.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. John Tomasi actually, in the question that he posed, covered part of what I wanted to react to, because I was interested in and concerned with this notion of a multiplicity of forms of universities with differing missions, which I think leads to greatly the core function of learning itself. So I wanted to hone in on the relationship between the task of learning and the necessity of academic freedom, so that I'm less concerned with the neutrality principle, which seems to be the theme uniting most of the presentations, save for Professor Krylov's, and more concerned with, do we understand what the function of learning is and what the institutional setting must be in order to foster that learning? For it seems to me that is what the Kalven Report attempts to address, and that's what all of these efforts attempt to address. Now, I happen to have been blessed to teach and be an administrator in a land-grant university. I've been a faculty member in a liberal arts institution. I've been a faculty member in a STEM institution. I've had very broad exposure, but the most interesting thing about all those exposures is I've always done the same thing in each one. I've always been retained for the same purpose in each one. So that as we begin to try to distinguish the functions of the various kinds of institutions, we mustn't forget that we're also talking about the functions of the learning itself. What is it that we as faculty do? What do we expect students to do? And again, it seems to me that was being brought out in the response to Tomasi's question, and particularly in Tomasi's formulation of the question.
Good. Thank you, Bill.
Professor Ciampi.
Oh, yes, Professor Ciampi, yes.
So actually my remarks follow up on what Professor Allen just said, but I think we have to consider the dirty realities before, in order to better understand why the core function of the university is changing. And in that sense, I guess my question is directed to everyone, but mostly to Professor Melnick, who spoke of the fundamental post-Enlightenment liberal order. And in the last 3 decades, essential feature of that academic liberal order has been the soaring costs of education, which have turned students into clients. For instance, I have a friend who's just been hired at Northeastern University, and one of the first things he was told in orientation was, your students are clients, so your courses are products. The Kalven Report speaks of discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. It doesn't use the phrase that has become most common today, which is knowledge production, seeing knowledge as a product. So then my question is, can we really defend the, I think, in my view, essential principle of institutional neutrality without also devising a policy for solving that issue of the cost of education?
Shep?
That's a big task, and in some ways at the heart of your question is what is the relationship between this institution of the liberal order, the university, and the fact that we live in a capitalist society. It creates some clear tensions. It creates enormous opportunities, and yes, it really points to the issue that the connection between universities and government has grown increasingly tight and complex. Student loans are the best example, and clearly a leading reason why college costs have increased so much. So I, on the one hand, I agree completely with you that these connections between government and a university are problematic, and that market forces have put us in a position where we are expected to be more client-serving and not less client-challenging. I'll just end that on a positive note where I find my students to be remarkably thoughtful and not to have engaged either in this entitlement status or in subject to political correctness. Maybe that's a good thing about Boston College students, but I think that put in the right environment, right in the right context, that students are much more teachable and much more thoughtful than we might have believed given all of these contrary forces.
Professor Krylov.
I want to also comment on this question. I think it's a big problem that university education is commercialized and students are seen as clients, as customers, and not as young people coming to be educated. And one worrisome example from recent events is that really made me worried. Just this year, a professor at New York University who was teaching organic chemistry class, it's a core class that pre-meds, for example, supposed to take, and it's very important. So students complained that the course is very hard, and that the grades that they get do not reflect the effort they put in the course, and things of that nature. Now, that's nothing new. We have complaints from students all the time. I teach similar class, general chemistry. But what is new is that university reacted to it, and instead of defending Professor Wright to grade the course following the same standards he was following for 50 previous years of his experience as a teacher, as a highly recognized teacher, excellent teacher, university didn't renew his contract. That's it. And I think it's a very dangerous trend.
Professor Londrigan.
So one of the recurrent themes this morning has been the tension on the boundary between principles and common sense. Yes, we're for free speech, or academic freedom, but then we can come up with the absurd cases. And I'm reminded that rules could be thought of in two ways, right? One way to think of them is that they're guidelines for benevolent administrators. And the other way is to think of them as Procrustean constraints on ideological zealots who perceive their agenda as common sense. And when we're writing down our rules, it's usually in a situation in which the administrators are sympathetic. And so we're seeing these sympathetic administrators at the time we write the rules, and we think, yes, we should go with the guidelines approach. But of course, we only need the rules, or in my opinion, when we're actually faced with the ideological zealot who thinks that they're implementing common sense when they're actually doing nothing of the sort, which would call for more Procrustean rules and pushing over the boundary that we'd usually want to draw about saying, well, now let's just rely on common sense. Maybe our rules need to be or defending the ideological neutrality of the university ought to be pushed out beyond where we normally go with common sense. I wonder what the panel think about that.
Anyone? Shep, go ahead, please.
I teach about and study the politics of regulation, so we see that all the time. And I guess what you really point to there is the difficulty of formulating rules that are adequate to deal with a problem basically that is in the culture. So what we're talking about here often is we're facing a culture that I think is often hostile to the things that we have been saying are essential to the role of the university. And some of these rules can be beneficial, of saying, you know, this is off limits, but we can't expect that we're going to have too much effect simply by changing the rules when what we really want to do is change the culture.
I'm going to go a little overtime because I think this discussion is so important, so we'll go a few extra minutes. Professor Amanda Green, I'm going to recognize you in a minute for the... Yeah, oh, yeah, sir. Rick, yeah, go ahead.
I do think it's important to think about Kalven's initial comment about what he was up to in writing that report. And it was very much like a linguist spelling out the underlying structure of an already existing language that perhaps hadn't been spelled out by the speakers of the language. And he was counting on it being an existing tradition. You know, he wasn't really trying to lay down a rule. He was saying, here's what we're about here at this institution, and he tried to characterize it. And then, of course, once you do that, now you have something that's more formal, and it can become an administrative role and used that way. But there's something about Stan's point about parchment regulations that are very thin and useless. And you know, even the enforcement issue, you want it to be a tradition which people recognize that's not a grammatical thing you've done within our tradition. And maybe speakers of languages tell that to each other when things are ungrammatical. But once we enter into formal rule administrative enforcement, it feels like we're in a different kind of world. And maybe that's not good either for a university. I also just want to raise something which we probably won't get to, but the idea, this is, Robbie, your initial comments, which were so wonderful, but I was sitting here thinking, reasonable people disagree. Now, what is that category? Because, of course, the truth is one, not many, so one or the other of them must be wrong. Would be the natural way. Now, how do we defend an environment that tolerates impartiality towards, is it really a debate if reasonable people can disagree, or is it showing us that reason cannot take us to the truth, and therefore we're just producing skeptics through this process? Or is it humility? Is it a kind of Pyrrhonian detachment that's the goal of the university? All those issues have to be examined, it seems to me, once we invoke reasonable people are disagreeing here. They're all reasonable. Well, are they all reasonable in the conclusion they drew? And if you think that's true, what's your picture of objectivity versus subjectivity? So there's some profound issues behind all this.
I've written a bit about that, but not as well as John Stuart Mill has in Chapter 2 of On Liberty, which I would commend. Before I give the final question to Professor Green, I just want to toss a kind of thought experiment out for the panel and for others here, especially those who, like the panelists and myself, are faculty members. As faculty members, we make hiring and promotion decisions for our colleagues. We decide whether to hire this person or that person for a slot in our department, whether it's chemistry or political science or history or cultural anthropology, whatever it is. We make tenure decisions, promotion decisions. Now, my understanding of our role, at least at non-sectarian universities, like Princeton or the University of Chicago or the University of Wisconsin, is that in evaluating a candidate, we shouldn't take into account that candidate's political party, religious affiliation, ideological stances. We want to know, does this candidate have achievements or at least promise of scholarship in his or her field? And do we have good reason to believe that this person would make an excellent teacher? Those are the two main criteria that we are supposed to have in mind. I don't need to know in order to decide those, whether a person is a Democrat or Republican, socialist or libertarian, pro-Israel, anti-Israel, pro-death penalty, anti-death penalty. And probably better if I don't know, so I won't be tempted to import political considerations into my judgment. But doesn't that presuppose something very much like institutional neutrality by the unit that I'm serving? If not, if in other words I knew that among the things our unit will be doing, in addition to conducting scholarship and teaching, is pronouncing to the general public on the death penalty, on Israel, on whether we should have Democrats or Republicans, if it's the case that I know that that's part of what we do, then it seems to me I have every reason to want to know when I'm hiring a person or voting on a hire or a tenure case, not only is this person a good scholar, will this person be an excellent teacher, but is this person Republican or Democrat? Pro-death penalty, anti. Pro-Israel, anti. And I don't see any way around that. Is there?
I just think that's too simple. And I don't think the world I live in works that way. And going back to what Rick was saying before, the tradition is important, obviously. Sorry.
Yeah.
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 Or just lean in.
Tradition isn't independent of the community. And that's true in all of our universities. And the community that I grew up in, and I started before you did, is a very different community than exists now in any university you speak about. I mean, when I started at Harvard, it was almost 100% white male faculty. Now, there's a lot we could say about that. It's not anymore, and that's true at Princeton and at Chicago,
Wisconsin,
and other places. And I think there are consequences for that. I don't think it's accidental, and I don't think it's a bad thing. So that now we have a much more, and come back to the word diversity, but now that we have a much more richly diverse community in the universities, I think there are a number of factors that are bound to be taken into account, whether or not we're explicit about them. So that I think this is a sort of a reduction to first principles that isn't faithful to the lived reality of what it is to govern a university.
Could I give it a try with you, Stan? So let's say that I anticipate, because we are not living by Kalven principles, I anticipate that in a year or two, we're going to be asked to make a statement. There will be sentiment to make a statement on whether Israel should exist, or whether we should divest from businesses doing business with Israel, or not allow Israeli academics to come, or whatever. I see that coming in a year or two. Now I have a job candidate who, if appointed in our department, is going to be one of the people along with me voting, and our other colleagues voting on that resolution. Should I take into account that person's views about Israel, or should I not?
I think you should not.
Should not, okay.
But I mean, I think I don't like the formulation.
I know it's an uncomfortable.
The two questions you gave are very different kinds of questions. I'm sorry, repeat the alternatives you gave me.
Pro-Israel or anti-Israel, pro-death penalty, anti-death penalty, Democrat,
I
Republican.
don't know, you put it in a slightly different way originally, but there are some questions that strike me as genuinely appropriate to be asked in the universities and others not. The question of whether or not Israel should exist is not appropriate. I don't see how that relates to the function that we're talking about. But there are some questions that are quite controversial and quite political that are appropriate. That's why I think to take these sort of, it's not a zero-sum game.
Anna?
I think I would be on.
Bill, I'll recognize you next, Bill.
I think I would disagree, because I think maintaining neutrality, that's a part of following the principle of merit and fairness when evaluating people for positions and hiring them. And in my experience in STEM, in chemistry, when I joined faculty at USC, I think the scene already was very diverse in a true sense of this word. There were people from different countries, different backgrounds, different scientific schools, and that emerged by simple application of a merit. Let's hire the best people, people who are best experts in this area, people who will be best teachers. And what I see is happening now when all kind of other criteria are being brought, I think it dilutes the merit, it results in intrinsically unfair outcomes, and it does not promote it doesn't serve the purpose of creating a better, more powerful scientifically and more effective teachers in the department. So that's another reason to maintain neutrality on these principles and not include any of this.
So I would ask, with respect to the set of questions, controversial matters, on which it would be reasonable and acceptable for a department to make a statement, on those matters, would it be in parallel permissible for me to ask a candidate what his view or her view was on that issue and cast my vote in part depending on whether I agreed with that person's view or not?
So this is, I mean, it feels to me like Hutchins' notion we're not a club is rather relevant here, because you're describing characteristics that are club-like, and maybe we have to admit we are a club, but we're a club of a very special kind, and the criteria for membership in that club define a set of questions that it is relevant to ask. Like, we're the club of individuals committed to freedom of thought, and we want to make sure you are going to be in that club on those grounds.
Agreed.
And because it's those grounds, these other questions cannot be asked. I mean, that's the way it would. So, maybe Hutchins is, we have to put aside the notion we're not a club. We are a club. We're a subculture. This is what it is. These are its characteristics. And we open the doors to anyone and potentially who agrees with that and will flourish in it and support it and defend it. And that defines the boundary of questions, it seems to me, that you can ask.
Bill Allen.
Problem is in these formulations, because we're speaking as if there were a hierarchy of values, but upon which we will not make decisions. And it seems to me that's impossible. For example, it may be you don't want to choose between a Republican and a Democrat. You want to choose between more white male, shall we say, and less white male? And is there really a difference between those two kinds of decisions? So it turns out that where we are trying to focus on the issues that you put on the table, Robbie, and whether we can make these tough choices even in employment decisions, we're acting as though the reality that people can reasonably disagree means that not only that both can be right, but as if it doesn't mean that both can be wrong. So that, since that's a false antinomy to leave the fact that both can be wrong out, and it produces incertitude, not skepticism. That then opens the door to overt versus furtive decision-making. So your real question is, will we do it openly or furtively? Will we prefer these categories in this hierarchy of values openly or furtively? Because it may be that it's impossible not to do it, which leads me therefore finally to say, what is really the ground we're standing on is that critical question: should it be field wide open? Should the whole question of regulation simply be dropped? And if the question of regulation is dropped, then it's really very difficult to preserve neutrality formally, though you will produce it functionally just by leaving it wide open.
Final question or comment from Professor Green. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you.
Oh, Stan.
I wanted to circle back to the challenge, which I heard in the comments from Professor Krylov at the very end, where she said maybe the better thing to do is just to have a rule, just to have a strict flat rule. Because opening it up for discussion and judgment and exceptions just creates a whole bag of worms. And I take this to be part of what John was asking about, like the reason you have a rule is because you don't want it to be open to people's judgment. But this leaves me kind of haunted by the quote presented by Professor Schwader. I think you said in the Kalven Report there was a paragraph that said, "There comes a time." And there comes a time seems to be what we're not wrestling with here. Because either we say there will never come a time, in the sense that officially that's our position, and then we're back to the proposal here, or we say there will come a time, and and that means different things. I can think of three. There will come a time when the fabric of society is imperiled. There will come a time when the academic enterprise is imperiled. And there will come a time when the relationship between the university and the society is imperiled. Any one of those three is valid grounds for saying there will come a time and the time has come, right? So my question is, can we please grapple with that? Are we going to accept this starting point of there will come a time? Because if so, that sets the conversation off in a certain direction. And there's a whole bunch of things that we need to grapple with if that's where we start from.
Was this the point on which Professor Stigler registered a dissent? Professor George Stigler was a member of the Kalven Commission, and although he agreed with the thrust of the report, he did drop a footnote to express dissent on a point. Richard, you probably know the details.
Yeah, he just wanted us to behave honorably with regard to our property holdings, if I remember correctly. I have to go back and look at it carefully. But and when I read that paragraph over, I sort of have this picture of disagreement and the massive project that would be involved, as you were suggesting, as actually having to set out what would count as an exception, look at all these different things the university does. Are we going to really start saying how you should give honors, who should get awards, whether government grants should be accepted if they have these strings to it? Why should we accept restricted gifts, which are essentially defining the research agenda of the university rather than unrestricted gifts? Every one of these things, you can see from a pure point of view of neutrality, would require that you say, I can't accept that. You're going to bias the questions that are going to be asked at this university by providing money for that grant. So I think they evaded it. I'd have to go back and see the exact wording. Do you have it there in front of you?
Yeah. Oh, do you, Nadine? Debbie, can you give Nadine the microphone? She can read it to us.
It's very short. The university, when it acts in its corporate capacity as employer and property owner, should, of course, conduct its affairs with honor. The university should not use these corporate activities to foster any moral or political values, because such use of its facilities will impair its integrity as the home of intellectual freedom.
Good. Okay, on that note, with much more to wrestle with.
And I want to declare I'm for exceptions.
You're for exceptions.
I mean, I think that, why do we grant exceptions with regard to religious freedom when there are rules of, why, Pete Seeger, or not Pete Seeger, it wasn't Pete Seeger, it was another Seeger, who had conscientious objection to war, and we were drafting everyone, should he get an exception or not? And I think that, like exceptions in the religious freedom, free exercise of religion domain, you ask yourself whether or not enforcing it really serves the purpose of the rule in the first place. And are there other considerations that outweigh the non-harm that follows from allowing that to be an exception? And the exceptions here, I think, are exceptions that are attempting to preserve the very grounds at which you're allowing the institution to go forward. I mean, they were imagining the barbarians at the gates. They were imagining what happened in, we had German refugees, on American college campuses, and certainly at the University of Chicago, who remembered the dissolution of free thought at German universities during the Nazi period. And they were sitting there saying, we're supposed to keep our mouths shut when that starts happening here.
All right, thank you all. We will reassemble for our second panel featuring Nadine Strawson, John Tomasi, Paul Clement, and Rosemary Monge at 1 o'clock back here. Will you please join me in thanking our panel?